There are moments when a person does not lose everything because someone plotted against them. They lose everything because for 1 second, the truth inside them escapes. One sentence, one cruel word, one ugly outburst in the wrong room, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong people. That was all it took for Ethan Carter to destroy the life he had spent years pretending to build. He stood inside the Fairfax County Courthouse in Virginia, wearing a Navy suit he could no longer afford, pointing across the courtroom at the woman he had once called his wife. Nia Bennett sat at the opposite table. Her hands were folded, her back was straight. Her face was calm in a way that made people uncomfortable, because it was not the calm of someone who felt nothing. It was the calm of someone who had already survived too much to be broken in public. Ethan's lawyer grabbed his sleeve. "Sit down," the lawyer whispered, but Ethan did not sit down. His face was red, his jaw was shaking. His pride had been dragged into the light, and instead of silence, he chose destruction. "You are nothing, Nia," he said, loud enough for every person in the courtroom to hear. "You hear me? Nothing. You dress up in expensive clothes and pretend you are somebody, but underneath all that fabric, you are still the same girl who needed me to make her look important." A sound moved through the courtroom. Not a gasp exactly, something heavier, something between shock and shame. The court reporter's fingers froze above the keys. A woman in the gallery put a hand over her mouth. The bailiff took one step forward, and Nia Bennett did not move. She had heard worse from Ethan behind closed doors, in their kitchen, in their bedroom, in the parking garage beneath their old apartment in Arlington, in whispered insults after fashion shows where strangers stood up to applaud her, while her own husband stood beside her and hated every second of it. But this time was different. This time, Ethan had said it where the world could hear. And what he did not know was that the man whose name he had mocked for years, the man he had called overrated, arrogant, and untouchable, had just stepped through security downstairs. Marcus Bennett, Nia's father, a black federal judge known across Washington, D.C., for three things: his silence, his discipline, and the way he could make a lying man feel naked without raising his voice. Judge Marcus Bennett had spent more than 30 years inside courtrooms, from the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse in Washington, D.C., to appellate hearings that shaped national law. He had faced corrupt politicians, billion-dollar corporations, violent offenders, and men who thought money could purchase mercy. But on that morning, he was not walking into Fairfax County Courthouse as a judge. He was walking in as a father. And when Ethan Carter finally saw him enter that room, the arrogance drained from his face so quickly that even his lawyer looked afraid. But to understand why that moment shook the entire courtroom, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the morning before everything fell apart. At 5:15 in the morning, Alexandria, Virginia, was still half asleep. The sky outside Nia Bennett's apartment window was the pale blue-gray color that comes before sunrise. The streetlights along King Street still glowed softly. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck moved past the brick storefronts of Old Town Alexandria, its engine humming against the quiet. Nia opened her eyes before the alarm rang. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Today was the day, the final hearing. The day her marriage would be weighed, divided, exposed, and ended. For 3 months, she had lived in a small apartment not far from the Potomac River, in a building with narrow hallways, old wood floors, and windows that rattled when the wind came off the water. It was nothing like the house in McLean she had once shared with Ethan. That house had a sweeping staircase, marble countertops, a walk-in closet large enough to hold half of her first collection, and a glass-walled studio where morning light poured across her sketches. She had paid for that house. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every piece of furniture Ethan later claimed he had chosen because he had an eye for refinement. But peace in a small apartment was better than fear in a beautiful house. Nia sat up slowly. On the chair beside her bed was the suit she had designed for herself: cream-colored wool, sharp shoulders, a narrow waist, wide-legged trousers that fell with perfect weight. No glitter, no drama. Nothing loud. Just quiet power stitched into every seam. Nia Bennett was a fashion designer, but not the kind who chased trends like a hungry dog chasing cars. She built clothing like testimony. Her designs carried structure, memory, elegance, and defiance. She had become known in New York, Washington, Atlanta, and Los Angeles for creating evening wear that made black women look not only beautiful, but undeniable. Her brand, Bennett House, had started in a rented studio near U Street in Washington, D.C., above a small jazz bar where music rose through the floorboards late at night while she sketched under a desk lamp. Her first clients were teachers, lawyers, singers, pastors' wives, nonprofit directors, and young executives who wanted to walk into rooms without shrinking. Then came the magazine features. Then came the celebrity stylist. Then came the invitation to present a capsule collection during New York Fashion Week. Then came the buyers from Saks Fifth Avenue. Then came the woman from Beverly Hills who ordered a custom gown and cried when she tried it on because, as she told Nia, "I have never felt like a dress understood me before." Nia did not become successful overnight. She built it the hard way. One sketch at a time, one fitting at a time, one sleepless night at a time, and Ethan Carter had watched all of it. At first he had clapped, then he had corrected, then he had competed, then he had tried to take credit. Nia walked into the bathroom and turned on the light. She looked at herself in the mirror, not with vanity, but with the seriousness of a soldier putting on armor. Her skin glowed deep brown under the soft light. Her eyes were tired, but steady. She brushed her hair back into a low bun, applied a little makeup, then stopped and placed both hands on the edge of the sink. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father. "I may be late. Court calendar shifted this morning, but I am with you." Nia read the message twice. Then she typed back, "I know, Dad, I love you." A few seconds later he answered, "I love you more. Walk in with your head up." Nia closed her eyes. She could hear his voice in those words. Marcus Bennett had raised her in Washington, D.C., in a townhouse not far from Capitol Hill. Her mother had died when Nia was 11, and from then on it had been just the two of them. A federal judge and his daughter. People assumed Marcus had raised Nia with strict rules, long lectures, and impossible expectations. They were only partly right. He had rules, yes. Tell the truth. Respect yourself. Never confuse attention with love. Never let someone who benefits from your silence convince you that speaking is dangerous. And, most importantly, never beg anyone to see your worth. When Nia was a child, Marcus would take her to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on Saturdays. They would walk slowly through the exhibits. He would explain history not as something dead, but as something that still breathed through the lives of people who remembered who they were. One afternoon, when Nia was 13, she stood before a display of old clothing worn by black women who had lived through times that tried to erase them. She whispered, "They still looked beautiful." Marcus looked down at her. They were beautiful, but more than that, they were human. That is what the world tried to deny them. Nia never forgot that. Years later, when she became a designer, she did not simply make clothes. She made declarations. That was what Ethan never understood, or maybe he understood it too well. Maybe that was why he hated it. Nia left her apartment at 6:45. The drive from Alexandria to Fairfax was quiet at first. The sky turned gold over Interstate 66. Morning traffic thickened near Falls Church. People in the cars beside her drank coffee, checked mirrors, adjusted ties, argued on speakerphone, lived ordinary lives. Nia kept both hands on the wheel. At a red light, she glanced at the garment bag hanging in the back seat. Inside was a black evening gown she had designed, not for a client, but for herself. It was the first piece she had created after leaving Ethan. She had brought it with her not because she planned to wear it, but because it reminded her of something. She could still create beauty after being broken. That mattered. By the time she reached the Fairfax County Courthouse, the sun was fully up. The building stood solid and cold against the morning light. People moved in and out through the front entrance. Attorneys with rolling briefcases, couples avoiding eye contact, families whispering, officers in uniform, clerks carrying folders. Nia parked, sat for a moment, then breathed deeply. "You are not on trial," whispered to herself. Then she got out. Her attorney, Rebecca Hayes, was waiting near the entrance. Rebecca was in her early 40s, with calm gray eyes, dark blonde hair pulled into a neat twist, and the kind of presence that made nervous clients breathe easier. She had handled high-asset divorce cases across Virginia, Maryland, and D.C., but what made her different was not her resume. It was the way she listened. When Nia first met her, Rebecca did not interrupt once. She sat across the conference table in her office near DuPont Circle and let Nia speak for almost an hour. Not just about money, not just about property. About the insults, the jealousy, the public charm and private cruelty, the way Ethan could smile at strangers while squeezing Nia's hand hard enough under the table to leave marks. When Nia finished, Rebecca had said only one thing. "We are going to document everything." And they did. Every message, every voicemail, every transfer, every receipt, every email where Ethan tried to represent himself as part owner of Bennett House, every social media post where he called the brand, our company, every cruel text he sent at midnight, when wine and resentment loosened his self-control. Now Rebecca looked at Nia's face and asked, "How are you holding up?" Nia gave a small smile. "I'm standing," Rebecca nodded. "Sometimes that is enough." Inside the courtroom, Ethan was already there. He sat at the opposite table in a tailored charcoal suit, his brown hair combed back, his face arranged into wounded dignity. His lawyer, Daniel Price, sat beside him. Daniel Price was well known in Fairfax and Arlington legal circles. Expensive, polished, theatrical. He had a way of speaking that made simple facts sound like tragic poetry when they helped his client, and irrelevant noise when they did not. Behind Ethan sat his mother, Margaret Carter. Margaret wore a pale blue dress, pearls, and the tight expression of a woman who believed disappointment was something other people caused. She had never liked me, not openly at first. Margaret was too polished for open ugliness. Her cruelty came wrapped in manners. At family dinners, she would say things like, "You are so articulate, Nia," or "I admire how ambitious you are. It must be exhausting always having to prove yourself," or "Your designs are very bold." Not everyone could get away with wearing something so ethnic. Each comment landed softly enough to be denied, hard enough to bruise. Ethan never defended Nia. Sometimes he smirked. Sometimes he changed the subject. Sometimes he later told Nia she was imagining things. "You always look for insult," he would say. "Maybe try being less sensitive." The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as Judge Helen Whitmore entered. Judge Whitmore was known as one of the most disciplined judges in Fairfax County. She had silver hair cut neatly at her chin, sharp eyes, and no patience for courtroom theatrics. She sat down, opened the case file, and looked over her glasses. "Good morning. We are here for Carter versus Bennett. Final hearing on equitable distribution and related motions." Her voice was dry, precise, and controlled. Daniel Price rose first. "Good morning, Your Honor. Daniel Price for Mr. Ethan Carter." Rebecca stood. "Rebecca Hayes for Ms. Nia Bennett, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed." Buttoned his jacket with one hand and stepped toward the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, this case is not merely about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about partnership. It is about sacrifice. It is about a husband who devoted years of emotional, practical, and professional support to his wife's rising career, only to be discarded the moment success arrived." Nia sat still. Daniel continued. "When Mr. Carter met Ms. Bennett, she had talent, yes, but talent without structure often remains only potential. Mr. Carter helped provide that structure. He attended events, cultivated relationships, advised on business strategy, managed household matters, and created the stability that allowed Ms. Bennett to focus on building what is now a valuable fashion brand." He paused, letting the words hang. "Now Ms. Bennett seeks to walk away with the home, the vehicles, the investments, and the business, while leaving Mr. Carter with nothing but the memory of his sacrifices. We believe equity requires more." Ethan lowered his head at the perfect moment. Margaret dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue. Rebecca did not move. Judge Whitmore glanced at her notes. "Call your first witness." Daniel turned.
"We call Mr. Ethan Carter."
Ethan rose slowly, as though carrying great emotional weight. He took the stand, swore the oath, and sat. Daniel approached him gently. "Mr. Carter, can you describe your marriage to Ms. Bennett?" Ethan inhaled. "I loved Nia. I really did. I believed in her before most people knew her name. When we got married, I thought we were building something together." His voice softened. "I went to every show, every event, every dinner with buyers. I helped her understand how to move in rooms she wasn't used to. I gave her confidence." Nia's fingers pressed together under the table. Ethan kept going. "She was brilliant creatively, but she could be difficult, emotional, defensive. She didn't always understand how business worked. I tried to protect her from people who would take advantage of her." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "And did you make professional sacrifices?" "Yes. I stepped away from real estate so I could help with Bennett House." "And how did Ms. Bennett respond to your support?" Ethan gave a bitter little laugh. At first, she appreciated it. Then the attention started coming. Magazines, New York, celebrities. Suddenly, I was just in the way. He looked down at his hands. She started acting like I was beneath her. Margaret shook her head sadly from the gallery. Daniel let the silence work. "No further questions at this time." Rebecca stood. She did not rush. She gathered one folder, walked to the podium, and looked at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, you testified that you stepped away from real estate to help my client, correct?" "Yes." "You were employed by Westbridge Commercial Properties in Tyson's Corner?" "Yes." "And your employment ended on April 16th of last year." "That sounds right." Rebecca opened the folder. "Your Honor, I move to admit Exhibit 1, a termination letter from Westbridge Commercial Properties." Daniel stood quickly. "Objection. Relevance." Rebecca turned slightly. Your Honor, Mr. Carter testified that he voluntarily stepped away from employment as a sacrifice for Miss Bennett's career. This document directly contradicts that testimony. Judge Whitmore looked at Daniel. Overruled. Rebecca handed copies to the court and counsel. Mr. Carter, this letter states that your employment was terminated following an internal review of inaccurate expense reporting and loss of a major client account. Is that correct? Ethan's face tightened. There were disagreements about how certain expenses were categorized. Were you terminated? Yes, but thank you. Rebecca let the words sit. So you did not step away from your career to support Miss Bennett. You were fired. Ethan's jaw worked. I still supported her afterward. We will examine that support. Rebecca picked up another document. Exhibit 2. Articles of Organization for Bennett House Design LLC. This company was formed by Nia Bennett 2 years before your marriage, correct? Yes. You are not listed as a founder. You are not listed as an owner. You made no capital contribution at formation. I contributed in other ways. I am asking about money. Ethan looked toward Daniel. Daniel gave nothing. No, Rebecca continued. Exhibit 3. Business Bank Records. The initial deposits came from Ms. Bennett's personal savings and a small business grant awarded through a Washington, D.C. creative entrepreneurship program. Correct? I don't know the details. Then let me show them to you. She placed the document before him. Do you see your name anywhere on these deposits? No. Exhibit 4. Studio lease near U Street in Washington, D.C. Signed by Ms. Bennett. Exhibit 5. Vendor invoices from New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. Paid by Bennett House. Exhibit 6. Payroll records for employees and contractors. Paid by Bennett House. Exhibit 7. Insurance, taxes, shipping, showroom fees, and production costs. Paid by Bennett House. She looked up. Can you identify one major business expense you personally paid? Ethan swallowed. I helped with strategy. That was not my question. I gave advice. Advice is not a wire transfer, Mr. Carter. A slight sound moved through the room. Judge Whitmore looked up. Silence returned. Rebecca walked a few steps closer. You also testified that you helped Miss Bennett enter rooms she was not used to. What rooms did you mean? Ethan shifted. Professional rooms, high-level rooms. Are you referring to the fashion buyers' dinner at the Hay Adams Hotel in Washington, D.C.? Yes, events like that. Were you invited to that dinner? I attended with Nia. That was not my question. Were you invited? Ethan hesitated. Nia was invited, and she brought you as her guest. Yes. Are you referring to the private fitting in Beverly Hills for actress Caroline West? I helped coordinate that. Rebecca lifted a printed email. Exhibit 8. Email chain between Caroline West's stylist and Ms. Bennett's assistant. Your name does not appear anywhere. Did you coordinate it? Ethan's ears reddened. I may have been involved verbally. Of course. Rebecca set the email down. Mr. Carter, let's talk about how you describe my client's work privately. Daniel stood. Objection. Rebecca did not look away from Ethan. Your Honor, Mr. Carter has placed his alleged support at issue. His private statements about Ms. Bennett's work are directly relevant. Judge Whitmore nodded. Overruled. Rebecca opened another folder. Exhibit 9. Text message sent from Mr. Carter to Ms. Bennett on September 9th. I will read it aloud. The room became very still. Rebecca read clearly. You think those people at New York Fashion Week respect you? They just want a diversity story in a pretty dress. Nia stared straight ahead. Rebecca lifted another page. October 23rd. You are not a designer. You are a charity case with good lighting. Margaret looked down. Rebecca continued. December 5th. Without me, you would still be sewing church dresses for women who pay in compliments. Ethan leaned forward. That was during an argument. Rebecca looked at him. So you did send it. He said nothing. January 17th. Your father's name opens more doors than your talent ever will. At that, Nia's face changed slightly. Not much, but enough. Rebecca placed the paper down. Is that the emotional support you were referring to? Ethan's voice hardened. You are twisting private marital arguments. I am reading your words. You don't understand what it was like living with her. Rebecca tilted her head. What was it like? Ethan made a mistake. He answered too quickly. She acted superior. Always walking around like she came from royalty because her father wears a robe and people call him Your Honor. Rebecca watched him. Her father is Judge Marcus Bennett. Ethan gave a bitter laugh. Yes, believe me, everyone knows. And you resented that. I resented being treated like I was beneath that family. Did Miss Bennett treat you that way? She didn't have to. It was in the air. In the air, yes. Rebecca nodded slowly. Let's bring the air into evidence. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second. He knew something was coming. Rebecca turned another page. Exhibit 10. A voicemail left by Mr. Carter on February 2nd at 11:48 p.m. She pressed play. Ethan's recorded voice filled the courtroom. It was slurred, angry, and unmistakably his. "You walk around like some queen because Daddy sits on a federal bench. But I know what you are, Nia. I know where you came from. That fancy studio, those white women clapping for you, that Vogue article, none of it changes what you are when the lights go off." The recording ended. The silence afterward was thick. Judge Whitmore's expression did not change, but her pen stopped moving. Rebecca looked at Ethan. "Do you deny leaving that voicemail?" Ethan stared at the table. "I was drunk. That was not my question." "No, you do not deny it?" "No, I don't deny it." Rebecca nodded. "No further questions at this time." Ethan stepped down from the witness stand, looking smaller than when he had climbed up. Daniel Price called Margaret Carter next. Margaret walked to the stand with careful dignity. She smoothed her dress before sitting, crossed her ankles, and looked at Judge Whitmore with a soft, wounded expression. Daniel approached gently. "Mrs. Carter, how would you describe your son during the marriage?" "Ethan tried," Margaret said. "He tried so hard. He loved Nia. He wanted to help her fit into his world." Rebecca's eyes lifted. Daniel nodded. "And how would you describe your relationship with Miss Bennett?" Margaret sighed. "I was always kind to her, but Nia was guarded. She never really embraced our family. I think there were differences in background that made things difficult." "Differences in background?" "Yes, upbringing, culture, manners, expectations." Nia looked down at her hands. Daniel continued. "Did you ever encourage your son to mistreat Miss Bennett?" "Never. No further questions." Rebecca stood. "Mrs. Carter, you said there were cultural differences." Margaret smiled tightly. "Yes. What culture were you referring to?" "Well, I simply meant that families are different, of course." "But you mentioned culture specifically." Margaret shifted. "I did not mean anything offensive. I did not ask what you meant. I asked what culture you were referring to." Margaret's smile became thinner. "I meant Nia came from a very different environment." "Washington, D.C.? That is not what I meant." "What did you mean?" Margaret looked at the judge, then back at Rebecca. "I meant she had a different way of carrying herself." Rebecca opened a folder. "Mrs. Carter, did you send your son a text message on March 12th of last year?" "I send my son many messages." Rebecca read from the page. "I told you, marrying outside your circle would bring trouble. Women like her always come with an agenda." The courtroom went still. Margaret's face drained of color. Rebecca looked up. "Did you send that message?" "It was taken out of context." "What context makes that statement acceptable?" "I was upset." "Upset about what?" "She had embarrassed Ethan at one of her events." "How?" "She corrected him in front of people." "What had he said?" Margaret hesitated. Rebecca waited. Margaret looked down. "He said Bennett House was their company, and Miss Bennett corrected him because it was not their company." Margaret did not answer. Rebecca read another message. April 7th. "You cannot build a family with someone who will always choose her people over yours." Daniel stood. "Objection." Judge Whitmore's voice was cold. "Overruled." Rebecca took one step closer. "Mrs. Carter, who are her people?" Margaret's hands tightened around each other. "I did not mean race." "I did not ask whether you meant race. I asked who you meant." Margaret swallowed. "I meant her circle of black designers, black clients, black mentors, and her black father." Daniel stood objection. Argumentative. Judge Whitmore looked at Rebecca. "Sustained. Rephrase." Rebecca nodded. "Mrs. Carter, did you disapprove of your son marrying a black woman?" "No." "Did you tell him not to?" "No." Rebecca lifted the first page again. "Then what did you mean by marrying outside your circle?" Margaret's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. Rebecca held her gaze for one more second.
No further questions.
Margaret stepped down from the stand without looking at Nia. By then, Ethan's performance had begun to crack. The sad husband was gone. The wounded supporter was gone. What remained was the man Nia knew. The man behind the smile. The man who could not bear losing control. Rebecca presented the final financial summary. "Your Honor, during the marriage, Ms. Bennett earned approximately $2.4 million through Bennett House Design, licensing agreements, custom commissions, and consulting work. Mr. Carter earned approximately $180,000 prior to termination, and nothing afterward beyond small consulting payments that were not sustained." She placed the summary before the judge. The McLean home was purchased with funds from Ms. Bennett's premarital savings and business income. Mortgage payments were made by Ms. Bennett. The Range Rover and Mercedes were purchased by Ms. Bennett. Business assets belonged to Bennett House Design, formed before the marriage and funded by Ms. Bennett. Investment accounts were funded by Ms. Bennett's earnings. She paused. Mr. Carter's claim that he built this life is not supported by documents, bank records, contracts, emails, or credible testimony. Ethan's breathing became louder. Daniel leaned toward him. "Do not react," he whispered, but Ethan had spent years believing his anger was power. He had mistaken intimidation for authority. He had mistaken Naya's silence for weakness. Judge Whitmore looked toward him. "Mr. Carter, before I take this matter under advisement, is there anything further you wish to add?" Daniel whispered sharply. "No, say no." Ethan stood. Daniel grabbed his arm. "Ethan." Ethan pulled free. "I do have something to say." Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Proceed carefully." Ethan laughed once, bitter and loud. "Carefully? That is rich. Everyone in this room has already decided I am the villain because she walks in here dressed like some innocent saint." Nia did not move. Ethan pointed at her. "She is not innocent. She is cold. She is calculating. She uses people. She used me. She used my family. And now she is hiding behind her lawyer and her famous father." Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "Mr. Carter." But he was past stopping. "You think that little fashion empire makes you special, Nia? You think because rich women in Manhattan and Los Angeles clap for you, that changes who you are?" The bailiff stepped closer. Daniel stood beside him, whispered, Stop now!" Ethan's voice rose. "You are nothing. You hear me? Nothing. You dress up in expensive clothes and pretend you are somebody, but underneath all that fabric, you are still the same girl who needed me to make her look important." The room froze. Nia's eyes glistened, but she did not blink. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. "And your father? That self-righteous man in a robe? He looked at me like I was trash from the first day. Like I was not good enough for his precious daughter. Well, let me tell you something. A robe does not make a man better than anyone else. He is just another arrogant black man who thinks the world owes him respect." The second the words left his mouth, even Ethan seemed to hear them. But it was too late. They were already in the air, already on the record, already written into the silence of the room. Judge Whitmore's gavel struck hard. "Mr. Carter, sit down immediately." Ethan stood, frozen. Sit down, or I will have you removed." Daniel physically pulled him back into his chair. The bailiff stood ready. Judge Whitmore's face had turned to stone. "This court will take a 15-minute recess. Mr. Carter, you are warned that any further disruption will result in contempt sanctions." The gavel fell again. Everyone stood as the judge left. For several seconds afterward, nobody moved then. The room exhaled. Whispers broke out. Margaret sat rigid, her face pale. Daniel Price leaned over Ethan and hissed, "Do you understand what you just did?" Ethan said nothing. Across the aisle, Nia stood slowly. Rebecca touched her arm. "Do you want a private room?" Nia shook her head. "I need air." She walked into the hallway. The courthouse corridor was bright, cold, and crowded. People passed by carrying folders, coffee cups, and the weight of their own disasters. Nia leaned against the wall near a window and closed her eyes. For the first time that morning, her hands trembled, not because Ethan's words were new, because now everyone else had heard them. There is a strange grief in public confirmation. When people finally see what you survived, part of you feels vindicated, another part feels exposed. Rebecca stood nearby, giving her space. Then Nia's phone buzzed. "Dad, I am in the building." Nia stared at the message. Another appeared. "Do you want me inside?" Her thumb hovered over the screen. She wanted to say no. She wanted to prove she could finish this alone. But healing sometimes begins when you stop confusing isolation with strength. She typed, "Yes." A few minutes later, the courtroom doors reopened. People filed back in. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench. Nia sat at her table again. Ethan kept his head down. His leg bounced under the table. Daniel stared at his legal pad as though the answers might appear there if he looked hard enough. Then the doors opened. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a steady push from the hallway. But every head turned. Marcus Bennett walked in. He wore a dark charcoal suit, white shirt, and deep burgundy tie. His hair was silver at the temples. His face was calm. His posture was straight, not stiff, but grounded, like an oak tree that had survived many storms and no longer needed to prove it could stand. He did not scan the room for attention. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The bailiff recognized him first. His shoulders straightened. Whitmore looked up. For the first time all morning, her expression changed. Just slightly. Recognition. Respect. Marcus Bennett walked down the aisle and took the empty seat behind his daughter. Nia turned. Their eyes met. He gave her one small nod. "I am here." That was all. Nia's lips pressed together. She nodded back. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. At first, irritation crossed his face, then confusion. Then Daniel Price leaned toward him, whispering urgently, "That is Judge Marcus Bennett." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Daniel's face went white. Federal district judge, former D.C., Court of Appeals nominee, Georgetown law lecturer. He has testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Ethan, that is her father. Ethan looked back again. Marcus Bennett was already looking at him. Not with rage, not with hatred. That would have been easier. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks at something deeply disappointing, but not surprising. Something small, something loud, something that mistook cruelty for strength because it had never learned what strength was. Ethan turned forward, his mouth had gone dry. Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. The court has reviewed the evidence, testimony, financial records, and the conduct observed in this courtroom today. Her voice was calm, but sharper than before. Mr. Carter, I want to make one thing very clear. Your statements in this courtroom are part of the record. Your words were not merely disrespectful. They revealed contempt not only for this court, but for Ms. Bennett's humanity. Ethan stared at the table. Judge Whitmore continued. The court finds that Bennett House Design LLC is Ms. Bennett's separate property. It was formed prior to the marriage, funded by Ms. Bennett, operated by Ms. Bennett, and developed through Ms. Bennett's labor, reputation, and creative skill. She turned a page. The McLean residence shall remain Ms. Bennett's property. The vehicles purchased by Ms. Bennett shall remain Ms. Bennett's property. Investment accounts funded by Ms. Bennett's earnings shall remain Ms. Bennett's property. Ethan's mouth opened slightly. Daniel put a hand on his arm. Mr. Carter is awarded his personal belongings and no ownership interest in Bennett House Design. Margaret closed her eyes. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses. Additionally, this court finds Mr. Carter in contempt for his conduct during proceedings. He is fined $10,000. Any further threatening, harassing, or discriminatory communication toward Ms. Bennett will be referred for appropriate legal action. She paused. Then she said the words slowly. Mr. Carter, the law cannot make you a decent man, but it can make sure your indecency has consequences. The gavel came down. Final. Ethan did not move. For the first time since Nia had known him, he had no performance left. No speech, no charm, no wounded expression. Just silence. In the hallway after court, Nia walked beside Rebecca. Marcus followed a few steps behind, close enough to protect, far enough to let her stand Nia. Ethan called. She stopped. Rebecca turned sharply. Marcus did not move. Ethan approached slowly. His tie was loose. His face looked drained, almost gray. I didn't mean it like that, he said. Nia looked at him. You meant every word. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, then back to her. I was angry. Yes. My life was falling apart. Yes. I said things I should not have said. For the first time, Ethan, you said them where other people could hear. That hit him harder than anger would have. He looked down. I loved you. Nia's voice remained soft. No, you loved how I made you look when you could stand beside me. You hated who I became when I no longer needed you to define me. Ethan's eyes watered. Maybe from shame, maybe from fear, maybe from the first honest mirror he had faced in years. I lost everything, he whispered. Nia looked at him for a long moment. No, you lost what you tried to take. There is a difference. She turned to leave. Then Marcus stepped forward. Ethan froze. Marcus did not raise his voice. Mr. Carter, Ethan swallowed. Yes, sir. You owe my daughter more than an apology spoken because consequences arrived. Ethan could barely look at him. I know, Marcus said quietly. No, that is not the same thing. Then Marcus turned and walked out with his daughter. The story did not end that day. Stories like this never end in the courtroom. They echo. By that evening, portions of the court transcript had begun circulating among legal reporters in Northern Virginia. By the next morning, an article appeared in a local outlet with a headline that spread quickly. Fashion designer wins divorce. Case after husband's racist courtroom outburst backfires. By noon, it had reached Washington, D.C. By evening, New York fashion accounts were sharing it. By the following day, everyone who had once praised Ethan for being the supportive husband behind the designer was reading his own words. His real estate contacts stopped answering calls. A private investment group in Arlington removed him from an advisory opportunity. A club in Georgetown quietly revoked his membership application. Margaret Carter stopped attending her weekly charity lunches at the Willard Intercontinental. Not because she had changed, but because people had begun looking at her with the same polite disgust she had once reserved for others. Daniel Price withdrew as Ethan's counsel within 48 hours. His official reason was irreconcilable breakdown in attorney-client communication. Unofficially, he told a colleague, I can argue law. I cannot argue a man out of being exactly who he proved himself to be. For several weeks, Ethan stayed in his mother's guest room in Richmond. At first, he was angry. He blamed Nia, then Rebecca, then Judge Whitmore, then Marcus Bennett, then the media, then society, then anyone except the man in the mirror. But life has a way of stripping a person down when there is nowhere left to hide. One night, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen after midnight. His mother had gone to bed. The house was quiet. Rain tapped against the window. His phone lay on the table. He had made the mistake of searching his own name again. The first results were all the same. His outburst, the transcript, the quotes, the analysis, the articles. Then he found a clip from a legal commentator who said something that made him stop breathing for a moment. Ethan Carter did not become that man in court. Court simply introduced him to the rest of us. He replayed the line, once, twice, 3 times. Then he turned the phone face down. For the first time, he did not feel angry. He felt seen, and that was worse. A week later, as part of the settlement negotiations in a related civil claim, Ethan agreed to counseling, anger management, and a racial bias education program. At first, he treated it like punishment. Then, during one session, the counselor asked him a question. "When did you first believe love meant being admired?" Ethan laughed, defensive, uncomfortable. But the question stayed with him. Over months, the laughter faded. He began to understand things he had spent his life avoiding. That he had loved being seen as generous more than he had loved being generous. That he had supported Nia only when her success reflected well on him. That the moment her light no longer made him feel bigger, he tried to dim it. That he had inherited prejudices from his mother and polished them into jokes, preferences, concerns, and private comments until they sounded respectable enough to deny. That cruelty does not begin with shouting. Sometimes it begins with entitlement. Sometimes it begins with resentment. Sometimes it begins with a man believing that a woman's greatness is acceptable, only as long as he can claim ownership of it. Months after the divorce was finalized, Ethan wrote Nia a letter. He was not allowed to contact her directly, so it went through attorneys. The letter was short. No excuses, no request, no plea. It read, "Nia, I will not ask for forgiveness because I understand now that asking would still make this about me. I humiliated you because I wanted to reduce you to something I could control. I called you nothing because your success made me feel like nothing. And instead of facing that truth, I tried to hand my emptiness to you. What I said in court was not a mistake. It was a revelation. I am ashamed it took losing everything to see what everyone else saw clearly. You built what you have. I did not build it. I stood near it and tried to take credit for the light. I am sorry, Ethan." Nia read the letter once. She did not cry. She did not smile. She folded, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in a drawer. Not because it healed everything, not because it erased the past, but because, for the first time, Ethan had written something true. A year later, Bennett House opened a flagship studio in New York City, not far from Bryant Park. The opening night was crowded with editors, clients, young designers, stylists, and women who had followed Nia's work from the beginning. Outside, the lights of Manhattan glowed against the evening sky. Inside, models moved through the space, wearing gowns inspired by places that had shaped Nia's life. One gown was deep blue and silver named Potomac. One was gold and ivory named Alexandria Morning. One was structured black silk with a sweeping back named Smithsonian. And the final piece was a white suit with sharp shoulders and a long flung train. It was named Unshaken. At the end of the evening, Nia stood before the crowd. Her father sat in the front row. Marcus Bennett looked older now, but proud in a way that made him seem almost young. Nia took the microphone. "I used to think strength meant never letting anyone see the wound," she said. "But I know now that strength is not hiding the scar. Strength is refusing to let the scar become your name." The room went quiet. She continued, "There will always be someone who tries to define you by their fear, their prejudice, their insecurity, or their anger. They may call you small because your growth threatens them. They may call you nothing because they cannot bear what you are becoming." She looked across the room, her voice steady. "But your worth is not created by applause, and it is not destroyed by insult. It was yours before anyone praised you. It remains yours after anyone leaves." Marcus lowered his head for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were shining. "Nia," smiled, "my father once told me that truth does not need to scream. It only needs room to stand. Tonight I am grateful for the people who gave me room to stand." The applause rose slowly at first, then louder. Then the entire room stood. Nia did not think of Ethan then. Not with hatred, not with longing, only with distance. Like a storm she had once survived, whose thunder could no longer reach her. And Ethan? He did not rebuild quickly. Consequences rarely move out of the way just because regret finally arrives. He worked small jobs for a while. He lived quietly. He kept attending counseling even after the court-required sessions ended. Years later, he volunteered with a community re-entry program in Richmond, helping men prepare for job interviews after incarceration. He did not present himself as a mentor with all the answers. He mostly listened. One afternoon, a young man in the program told him, "I lost everything because I could not control my mouth." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "No, you lost everything because of what was already in your heart. Your mouth just exposed it." The young man stared at him. Ethan looked down at his hands. "I learned that the hard way. He never remarried. He never became famous again. He never fully escaped what he had done. But he did change enough to understand that remorse without transformation is only self-pity, dressed in nicer clothes." As for Nia Bennett, she kept building. Bennett House became more than a fashion brand. It became a mentorship program, a scholarship fund, and a training space for young black designers who had been told their work was too bold, too specific, too cultural, too much. Nia told them the truth. Too much for the wrong room may be exactly enough for the room you are meant to build. And every year, on the anniversary of the day she walked out of Fairfax County Courthouse free, Nia had dinner with her father in Washington, D.C. Sometimes they went to Old Ebbitt Grill near the White House. Sometimes they walked past the Lincoln Memorial at night when the marble glowed and the reflecting pool held the lights like stars. Sometimes they sat quietly on a bench near the National Mall, watching strangers pass through a city built on power, memory, conflict, and hope. One evening, Marcus asked her, "Do you ever wish I had said something that day?" Nia looked at him. "In court?" He nodded. She smiled softly. "No. Why not?" "Because you taught me that presence can speak louder than defense." Marcus looked away toward the Washington Monument rising pale against the darkening sky. Then he said, "I wanted to protect you." Nia reached for his hand. "You did." He turned back to her. She squeezed his fingers. "You raised me to know the difference between being attacked and being defeated." Marcus said nothing. He did not need to. The city lights shimmered around them, and somewhere far behind her, in a courtroom she no longer feared, the echo of Ethan Carter's cruel words had finally lost its power. Because he had called her nothing. But nothing does not build a fashion house. Nothing does not survive humiliation with grace. Nothing does not walk into court with her head high while lies fall apart around her. Nothing does not turn pain into purpose. Nothing does not teach other women to stand. Nia Bennett was never nothing. She was a daughter, a designer, a survivor, a builder, a woman who learned that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the sound of a person refusing to wrestle with someone beneath the truth. And when the truth finally stood up, it did not have to shout. It simply walked into the room wearing a charcoal suit, sat behind her, and reminded everyone there that dignity does not beg to be believed. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it lets justice speak.